I may have had a bang on the head, but this is a dash queer story.
Ready when you are.
Monasteries, Mandarins and Patrick Moore, all on this 19th episode of I'll Explain Later, the Doctor Who podcast that only costs a bob a knob, with your hosts, John West,
Matt Needer,
and made near Birmingham, Jim Hall.
Tonight, new companion Stephen Taylor isn't convinced of the First Doctor's wild claims until Hartnell presents him with a bizarre-looking helmet. Peter Butterworth's up to no good as the Time Meddler.
Sensitive racial portrayals, and a brilliantly executed giant rat are let down by 6 dreary episodes of Victorian horror pastiche. Well, that's what conventional fan wisdom would have you believe. But can we turn things topsy-turvy for the Talons of Weng-Chiang?
And bow ties are cool, fish fingers and custard, and the fairs is yet to come. Matt Smith starts as he means to go on in his debut adventure, The 11th Hour.
Happy New Year!
Happy New Year!
Hey!
Welcome to January. We're kicking off January and this whole new year with the Time Meddler from 1966.
5.
Okay.
Close.
The July, it was most of July 1965, 4 episodes.
In which the First Doctor and Vicky, with their new companion Stephen, landed Northumbria in 1066, encounter some locals. There's a little bit of a Viking invasion that's a-coming. But the big point of the story, of course, is Peter Butterworth as the Time Meddler, and famously this is the first time we get to see someone else from the Doctor's own race. The gist of the story really is the Doctor, despite being in 1066, coming across various anachronisms, toasters, wristwatches, this kind of thing. So, guys, what did you think of this?
You're making eye contact with John there as well, so
Who's
John
rubbing his eyes blearily.
Well, I did have a rather heavy New Year's Eve. In fact, we're recording this from my flat. I'm still wearing my dressing gown. I'm in shell shock, essentially.
And did the Time Meddler help?
Well, you see, this is it, because that's the reason I mention it. So I watched rather a lot of Doctor Who in short order. After
Most of 2017 has been spent watching Doctor Who.
That's right, actually. But no, so I did watch it all in one block, which perhaps isn't the best idea. This, for me, was... We often talk about what I would term a sort of Doctor Who procedural. Typically, we've tended to think of that in terms of sort of Monster of the Week, that kind of thing. But in terms of doing a historical with a bit of sci-fi business, this feels like the sort of mould-setting version of that.
Absolutely.
If you think of something like Mask of Mandragora, which obviously is more fully formed and comes after some of the Pertwee business, horses running around and action and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, there's that sort of pattern of sci-fi stuff blended into a historical setting, and this feels like the sort of the mold from which others then will be created.
Absolutely.
So I sort of feel that it's perhaps, having watched a few of those now, this is not necessarily the most exciting one, but you feel its importance and relevance in terms of setting the scene for some of that stuff that's going to come later. In terms of the sort of laying down of mythology of the show, as you were saying, Jim, the first time we meet, though Gallifrey is not referenced,
or indeed the Time Lords,
but a member of the Doctor's race, I think it's handled really well. I think enigmatically, they don't explore too much, and they don't do the John Nathan Turner thing either of making this mythos somehow interesting. It's more interesting that it's enigmatic and slightly at arm's length.
It's very casual as well.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's the thing. I mean, I really like this, but mainly because, I really like this era. I approach it, I think, with a certain level of indulgence, and I think it delivers. Certainly, and I think a lot of the kind of attention to detail that a lot of those, especially early Hartnells, they're not taking anything for granted. I think it's sort of more interesting in retrospect because of what it very casually sets up. And I think this is the first, you almost feel like a light bulb going off in Dennis Spooner's mind when he realises that for the first time, the format of the show, so i.e. the setup, the Doctor with companions travelling in the TARDIS to various points in the past and future, can in and of itself be used as a subject matter for stories, rather than it simply being something that enables the story that we've got this week.
And to be clear, Dennis Spinner wrote this.
Dennis Spinner wrote this, yes. And I think that's possibly the start of a slippery slope for Doctor Who, and I think it's something that will, comes up a few times, I think, in the stories we're going to discuss over the next couple of months. So I think start of 2017, quite interesting to see this now, and especially seeing this, thinking that, last night I watched the first episode of the new series of Sherlock, which I'm not sure if either of you watched, I assume.
Yeah. I was going to bring that up when we review the 11th Hour later.
I think it's a point where it's very tempting, I think, for shows with very strong formats to start, I think, somewhat parasitically recycling their own tropes as opposed to simply using that as a format to do new stuff. And I think I'm entirely forgiving of it in the context of the Time Meddler, because their experiment this week has simply been, what if time travel was, what if there was another time traveler, and it turns the mirror back on the Doctor, and what if someone who could do the same things as the Doctor and had the same powers, had a very different approach to it. And that, to me, in an era where Doctor Who is week on week experimenting with doing something completely different, that's this week's experiment of the week. And I think it's lightly handled. It's not given too much kind of gravitas or over importance as it would be under, as John said, J&T, or perhaps, a Davis or a Moffat or something that kind of consciously, right, we're doing this week. But it's quite hard to separate it out from the fact that, it's like, it's been such a thrill to see how nuts and how experimental the Hartnell era is. And at the point where sort of just the trappings of formats start to creep into the series here, it's hard not to have just a slight twinge, I think, of like, oh, okay, this is where it's going.
Yeah, just going back to John's point earlier about you've seen this done since, and this feels like the template for it. An interesting thing with this is, fans generally call them pseudo-historicals. It's a historical thing, but there's an alien there as well. And it doesn't feel so much like one of those, I don't think. I think because the main thing is that it's a time traveller and it's one of the Doctor's own people, rather than something we've seen many times since. It'd probably be the Time Warrior, I should think, is the first time we really get that. Where it's more the alien happens to be here and they're worshipped as a god or something by the locals. No, I just totally agree with Matt's points, really. This doesn't feel like it's coming in as an attempt to do a new archetype of story, which is they're going to go back and keep doing or building on. And if this is 1965, we don't even get anything else about the Doctor's people until the War Games in 69. I'm just going to say, I feel this feels really fresh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
I don't feel I'm watching this with any baggage of what's going to happen with that kind of idea after the fact.
Not at all, and I wouldn't want to overstress the fact that, this was sitting there really bothering me, or it irked me that they were doing this. It is as fresh as, I think, any of the other sort of Hartnells that really work, in terms of it just being a great idea that they run with for that particular week, and then further down the line they'll pick up another idea and run with that. It's only really with the sort of benefit of hindsight where you've seen sort of endless iterations, and particularly, coming, in the midst of an era where, through the whole of sort of modern Doctor Who, Davis and Moffat, this isn't just me kind of raising this as a stick to beat Moffat with, although, I don't think he does it particularly well. But that sort of, it's all about Gallifrey, it's all about the Doctor's people, it's all about the Doctor's secrets and his mysteries and his way of life and his machine and all of that kind of thing. I find that sort of thing a bit tiresome compared to the freshness of the Hartnell sort of ethos of like, well, this is where he turned up this week. Mm-hmm. But that said, it does feel fresh, and that certainly didn't bother me watching it.
And John, I think we met the other night and you said you'd seen this when it was repeated in 92?
Yeah.
Were your memories of it kind of fresh, or were there surprises in store? I'm specifically asking, was the episode 3 cliffhanger something you remembered or you were already aware of, which is when Vicky and Stephen find the TARDIS, the monk's TARDIS? Yeah,
absolutely. That was the bit that I really remembered. I remembered the sort of, what is it? It's a sepulchre, isn't it?
Yeah.
I remembered that being the TARDIS, and that's basically my still image sort of telesnap memory of it from 1993. Remembering them sort of around that as the TARDIS. I didn't really remember much of the story, but I remembered the concept of the Meddling Monk, and I remembered his TARDIS being the sort of this stone table. What I thought didn't really work I suppose, is ultimately the motivation of the meddling monk in wanting to meddle. I mean, I suppose insofar, you get the impression he does it more or less just to pass the time and to have some fun.
That's not made terribly clear, and I think it's one thing. I mean, I think in that sense, the monk...
a lot of trouble to go to.
Yes.
To stop Harold Hardrada from invading so that Harold will be fresh enough to defeat William the Conqueror when he arrives on the south coast.
Yeah. Because Harold will make a good king and that will advance...
He'll make a good king. I know he will.
Yeah.
And he comes up with some flim-flam about,
it'll stop these wars in Europe and we'll have flight by the 1300s.
Yeah, and Shakespeare will do... Oh, that's a great bit, by the way, when he says that. And Shakespeare, he'll do his plays on television. And the Doctor goes, And the monk says television. He says, yes, I'm familiar with the medium. It's just a great little bit of snobbish
It is a nice
bullshit.
bit of business, yeah.
But yeah, it's weird because also when we see, by coincidence, I think coming a month after we saw the second appearance of the monk in the Daleks Master Plan, which we reviewed on December's show, and we talked a little bit about how there are some, it's not consciously a prototype, obviously, because they weren't looking that far forward into the future, but there are definite parallels between the monk and the master. What they've solved with the master is very much the motivation, and that shifts over time, but it's very much like the master is evil and he is motivated by...
They've sorted the motivation.
Yeah.
He's evil.
That he is evil and he is motivated by chaos or destruction, or he's power mad, he's insane. Whereas, this is the thing, it's like the Doctor is very clear that what the monk is doing is in breach of the Doctor's moral standards and these laws of time that he appeals to, that you can't interfere and that you shouldn't interfere. But is the monk actually evil? Is the monk...
Well, no.
Which is a really interesting sort of...
Well, yeah, because there are two things. First off, this is pretty much a year after the Aztecs.
Yes.
So this goes out. And that, again, is a big one in terms of the Doctor saying we mustn't interfere, we mustn't intervene.
Sounds like you went down a very similar wormhole to me on this.
And he sort of he thinks and he maintains that line here, but by holding up a mirror to him in the form of the monk, it sort of he pretends he claims that he doesn't interfere, but Doctor Who would be a terribly dull show if he didn't.
No.
And actually, I think having the mirror image of him, having somebody who is playful, almost just doing it for a laugh to see what would happen, you realise the skillful way in which the Doctor does intervene and constantly intervenes in his travels. But at the same time, he is something of a hypocrite because he goes around saying don't interfere when he interferes. So it's quite interesting to have that mirror of the Doctor in front of him. And I suspect we'll get to the fact that when it came to drafting the Master in the early 70s, I suppose maybe they would have thought about how that played here. Certainly they're meant to be of an equivalent sort of level here. The second thing, though, to answer your question directly, he gives one of the Saxon guys penicillin to stop him from dying. Admittedly, at the same time as he plans to obliterate a Viking fleet with atomic bazookas or whatever. But he doesn't seem wholly evil, does he?
No, I don't think he is evil. I think he's probably, if the Master's power mad, this guy's probably just someone who likes to see what he can get away with, I suppose.
Yes, he's a dabbler, sort of.
Well, he's always called the Time
Meddler,
Meddler, the Meddling Monk. I think Meddle is exactly the kind of...
Well, it's in some ways, he's a very similar character to the Doctor, but less bound by the Doctor's strictures about what you should and shouldn't do. It's not that he's the Doctor's opposite number or the sort of cracked mirror evil version of the Doctor.
And it is curious that he's so het up on English and Earth history. I mean, I'm not going to suggest there's any deep meaning to that because it's just what else would he be obsessed with for 60s,
especially given the setting. Yeah,
60s tea time drama. No, he feels more like if a history teacher was given that and was trying to sort of. So, as an extent, he's trying to do things his way.
I think if the Doctor is the Doctor, this is the monk is a trickster. He's much more a trickster than an evil or malevolent.
But even though that suggests he's trying to mix things up to rub his hands together, whereas I think I don't know.
I think there's a degree of that, isn't there?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, how well drafted was the script, Did they have that amount of character detail going into the monk when he was created.
Well, I don't know. I mean, Spooner was very much the man of the moment, and throughout the 60s, I mean, he's Mr. TV, more or less, isn't he?
Yeah.
I'm going to say he's Mr. T. But no, I love his little board when it's kind of, this is his itinerary
He's got his
of
like
10 things to
checkbox
do
of
or
all the
something.
things he's got to
And
do,
his
which
end
ends
is
with Meet King Harold.
Meet King Harold, which sounds like the most exciting thing you could
It's
possibly
quite sweet,
do.
really.
A bit of hero worship or something.
Now, I just want to pick up on what you said about the Aztecs, because I think that is a fascinating sort of companion piece to this. In that initially I was thinking, in terms of just the sort of the fun that this story has with setting up the anachronisms, and we can go into detail on those in a bit, but they're beautifully played, like the little bit of like the bit where the record accidentally slows down when it's playing the Gregorian chant and the but finding the wristwatch and all of that. It's so beautifully played, but I was initially thinking, well, this is history played as entertainment, sci-fi entertainment, and that it stands as something of a kind of rebuke to the, what you might more loosely term the kind of Lucarotti version of how you do a historical story. So we've seen in the Aztecs and in the Massacre, the Aztecs is all about history carries on, it follows its course, you can't interfere and you shouldn't. And the Massacre obviously is all about being a bystander to an appalling event that you cannot and shouldn't stop. So I was initially thinking, like, well, Spooner's coming at this from a completely different angle to Lucarotti. But then I actually think they sort of orientate themselves along the same lines. So I was very curious in the bit where the Doctor is lecturing the monk about how interference is wrong and you should never interfere with it. The monk says, how do you think Stonehenge was built? They could never have done that if I hadn't brought along my hydraulic lifts. Which is in some way saying that, like, the monk was always part of what we view established history to be. And that to me seems very similar to what the conclusion of the Aztecs was, that where Barbara was attempting to sort of subvert the course of history, actually anything she did was sort of folded into the established pattern of events. So I just thought that was really interesting, that much as the Doctor's lecturing the monk on what is a moral failure, the Doctor is in and of himself wrong, because if the monk has always been there helping with things like Stonehenge and all of that, then that's simply what happened. That is history.
No, that is interesting. And there's a weird bit in this which seems quite sophisticated for the time, which is when Stephen and Vicky are sitting there thinking, well, what if he does change history? Well, we know about it. And it's something about their minds they know their minds will be retrospectively wiped of it, which seems quite a sort of sophisticated concern for something from a kids' TV show of the time.
And which just comes back to the fact that I don't think any of this stuff is left to chance. I think there's a lot of later Doctor, especially the kind of quote-unquote pseudo-historical, where this sort of stuff is ignored or sort of treated with a bit of a wave of the hand. But whereas I think Spooner is much more interested in just the sheer sort of entertainment and rollicking adventure than Lucarotti is, who I think, is clearly a writer who's bothered by this kind of stuff and thinking about it. It's still all there. It just comes out differently. And
it's more playful, isn't it?
That's exactly it.
That goes right through to even the casting of, say, Peter Butterworth as the Meddling Monk.
He's great. I love him.
He is. He's terrific. And, of course, most famous for his contribution to the Carry On films. But he really is very playful in this, isn't he? And
great
cheeky.
foils with Hartnell as well.
He is,
it's brilliant. I mean, the bits where the two of them, especially when they're sort of
Hartnell
sparring
sort of treats him
about...
like a naughty schoolboy, doesn't he?
Well, also when they're sparring about their TARDISes and getting very competitive with each other.
Yes.
How they all work.
Well, yeah, because he's got a Type 4, isn't he? The Meddling
The
Monk.
Monks is a Type 4.
And he says to the Doctor...
I don't think is mentioned at this point.
No, he says to the Doctor, so which one have you got? Never you mind, he says. It's great.
And then quickly says, oh, you're from 50 years later than me or something. So sort of
but also when the Doctor gets the... their sparring is amazing, because I was really struck by the bit where the Doctor gets the dimensional control, that's it, out, and he hoiks it out on a bit of string. And it's almost like unabashed glee from the First Doctor about like just how excited he is to have thwarted the monk. And then that
thwarted screwed him over thoroughly.
I know. And he really does, especially leaving him the catty letter that he writes from
Oh,
at
yeah,
the end,
absolutely.
which is a great final shot as well, like of the monk sort of sitting in the corner of the abandoned monastery.
And he was so anguished.
No!
Yeah, it's really good. You talked already about some of the anachronisms. Now, the anachronisms serve two purposes narratively. The first, of course, being that you get the sense that there is something wrong.
It's the first alarm bell, isn't it?
Yeah, and we know that they've not been left by the Doctor. It's not like, either Stephen or Vicky have dropped their watch or anything. They're coming across anachronisms that have been placed there by other people. But the other thing it does narratively, at the beginning at least, is Stephen is not convinced that they are in fact time travellers. And so when they arrive in 11th century England, he finding the watch, for example, says, well, look, you still think this is 11th
century?
This
is proof that the Doctor's talking bollocks.
Exactly. Yeah. That is interesting in the characterization of Stephen, because we've always said throughout that we really like him and the fact that he calls out the Doctor on his bullshit. And it seems that was there from... that he doesn't trust things. He questions them constantly, and that's right there from the beginning.
I was going to say, because he's a new companion, you almost have to re-establish the setup of the show as well, which you think he does very well. Mm.
It's such a great TARDIS crew, this. I mean, like, Stephen and Vicky are great. I mean, obviously Vicky perhaps slightly less well-developed than Stephen, but just their interaction is so wonderful. And actually, I think, because a lot of it is driven by, the plot, in and as it stands, is actually quite thin, in that about 3 of the episodes are just Stephen and Vicky trying to catch up with the Doctor. But their interplay, it's not like a sort of Tegan and Turlough thing as they bicker their way around a situation and you just want to hit fast forward. They are hugely entertaining to watch together.
It's exactly... No, I couldn't agree more. And there's a wonderful bit in episode 4 where Vicky says, he's the crew, we're just the passengers.
We're just the passengers, yeah.
And then Hartnell comes back and says, and very welcome ones too. And
that's great.
That warmth, yes, you can immediately understand why these people travel together.
Would hang around together.
Which is completely absent from, say, the 80s.
Say, Andy Davis and
Yes. Which then leads into this great end shot, though, in episode 4, when you've got these kind of overlays of their faces against the stars.
Well, because I didn't
that's
realise...
beautiful, isn't it? I had assumed that had been done afterwards.
Well, I didn't realise that this was the series finale to Series 2, wasn't it? Which, in a way... because we've often talked about how the series finale is such a new series concept. And I'm willing to suspect that it's entirely an accident of production here. But that said, a big final episode where the Doctor is unexpectedly comes into conflict with another member of his own species who he never thought to see, and there's another TARDIS, and then it finishes...
That's a bit of a deal, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like a big deal as a way to round out the series. But yeah, those final Starfield shots are absolutely lovely, and it does sort of reaffirm, I guess, because you've lost all of the, apart from Hartnell, you've lost all of the regulars across the course of the season and replaced them. But to actually say, like, now, these are our characters at the end, it's such a lovely moment.
We've talked about these anachronisms that turn up, and yeah, as you say, it's great because it gets the mystery going, and we'd like to think anyone watching Doctor Who is kind of open-minded to that kind of thing, and will put the pieces together that things aren't quite what they seem. I've got to say, at the time, apparently audiences weren't very keen on this, apparently. There's quite a lot of stuff from audience research saying, oh, this is just silly, why would there be gramophones at this kind of point in history? And I think that's kind of interesting that now it's kind of a set thing that time isn't, time's out of joint or whatever. Whereas at the time it just probably to a lot of people felt like a silly comedy sketch or something. No, I did find that interesting. That
I mean,
it was such an odd idea that people just didn't have time for it.
I mean, it didn't seem to me to be narratively unexplained. And indeed, there were very clever bits in it. So Matt already mentioned the gramophone. So, of course, because the Meddling Monk is hiding out in the monastery, he doesn't want anyone to come there. So he gives the impression that there's loads and loads of monks living there by playing this Gregorian chant record on the gramophone. And as you said, occasionally, I guess he's not wound it up enough, and it slows down. So it's and it's very funny.
Such a striking moment.
But it also, I think it's very clear at that point that he's playing it. It's there to be funny, but also to point out that this is a trick.
But also, it's done so subtly as well, and that's, I think, comes on to one of the things that I think is really successful about this is just how beautifully it's realised. Like, I think the direction is phenomenal. I think the design is phenomenal. And it's almost like you so by... Because also, I know we talked a lot about the sound design of this era when we looked at the Daleks Master Plan last month. Everything is so sort of dripping with atmosphere that bit where just, the record slides and suddenly you're just taken out of the moment sort of briefly. You're sort of shocked into thinking that it's something else. It's so great. But, I mean, just the No, the sets are incredible. The forests, feel really real.
The woods are terrific.
The woods are terrific, but also that shot, that shot near the top,
going over the top. This is all.
Well, that shot of the monk sitting at the top of the mountain, with the clouds going past him, looking down at the waves crashing on the shore and the TARDIS appearing. I mean,
and all the
is this
seagulls and that?
I'm going to really show my ignorance, but when was the Seventh Seal made? Because that.
Oh God, I think the late 50s.
Yeah. Okay, so it's a few years earlier than this. It's like that's what that reminded me of like the hooded monk observing on the beach.
Not only that, there's a bloody Viking ship.
Yeah,
I mean, there's footage of a real sort of.
Apparently that was from a news footage of an anniversary celebration from I think.
But it's so
1949.
skillfully.
Yeah, it's well
weaved
integrated.
in.
Yeah.
It's not like in the 70s when they suddenly cut in a piece of NASA Apollo footage or something.
Although
and then
in fairness,
it's like,
with that, it's in colour, so it's a lot more jarring.
Of course,
but I think you can still tell when it's.
Well, I think, and all this
it works better.
I think all the things of like the waves and everything, all the sea shots are kind of stock shots as well. But yeah, it's so beautifully integrated that
Very well constructed, all of it.
The sense of scale to it is terrific.
Yeah, the sense of scale, particularly. I mean, even in the model work, with the TARDIS against the backdrop of the cliffs and what have you. I mean, in addition to which, there's some terrific. We mentioned the direction. The director was Douglas Camfield, right?
Yes.
Now, it's a bit of pedigree there, right? I mean,
is definitely regarded as one of the greats. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, we mentioned Dennis Spooner, who was involved in seemingly most of the iconic cult shows of the 60s. I think he was Man in a Suitcase was one of his, but yeah, he was very much Mr. TV. He does, though, appear to have put some real zingers into the script.
It's a really funny script.
It's very funny. The constant thing where Stephen wants to call him Doc, and the Doctor's really annoyed by this.
Tor.
Don't call me Doc. But also the fact that when Stephen, I don't know what's the preceding story?
The chase.
Yeah, so he's obviously ended up in the TARDIS.
Stowed away, yeah.
Yeah, and he emerges clutching this toy panda.
That's such a great scene where he says, what does that button do? And he said, well, that's the scanner, those are the doors, this is the console, that's a chair with the panda on it. Sheer poetry, my dear boy. It's such a wonderful
It's really
line.
funny.
But also the bit as well with the where Vicky explains what TARDIS stands for, and he says, "Idbe, I don't believe it."
Yes.
Which is really good. That's such a nice bit of characterization, though, that rather than just having... It would be such a stock thing to have Stephen sort of angry or freaked out. And it's like, I love the fact that he basically suspects that they're winding him up, but he kind of chuckles and plays along with it, and he enjoys like rumbling this con man, the Doctor. Is like, oh yeah, I'll catch him out eventually, and then is convinced of the reality of the situation.
Well, I think the characterization is pretty interesting, not just with the companion. I mean, and Vicky does feel a bit shortchanged, I have to say. But some of the villager characters, the Saxon villagers, are really quite interestingly drawn. They're very slight. You don't necessarily know about their motivations, etc., but narratively they serve really good purpose. So
they're very much the B plot, though, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. But
If
the men are brutes and thuggish, and the women are more nuanced and interesting, particularly
the
Edith.
woman?
No, there's...
Are there a few?
There's two women because they turn up with food for the month.
Oh,
yeah.
So they're generous and thoughtful and more nuanced, and they don't immediately assume that the travellers are bad.
And then the monk plays that so beautifully as well. It's like, today is a day of solitude, my child. And, the way he slips in and out of character.
My son, my child, that sort of stuff.
It's wonderful.
But also you get a sense that Edith, because her husband is the chief, Woolnoth, she's managed to imbue him with some of her wisdom, because he's the one who kind of is led to believe that maybe they need to think about the situation, clocks that it's odd that the monk...
Yeah, when he comes out with his shirt off. And he
and he kind of clocks... I mean, I think it's fairly clear. I don't want to go too far down this, but when the Vikings turn up and pillage the village and they meet Edith, I mean, it's pretty clear that they've raped her, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, it's great they don't make that explicit and don't need to, but it's one of those things. If you're old enough to know what's going on, you'd make that connection.
Yeah, it's nicely done in that regard.
Doesn't happen,
Yeah, there's an implied violence to it. Which
she's pretty much just shell-shocked afterwards, isn't she?
Which...
dead for a while.
I thought she'd copped it. But
and then when you realise she's still alive, there's that as an adult watching it, there's that nasty, very nasty, dark sort of edge. But it being a children's show, of course, they don't go too far down that route. But if you are there with your kids watching it, or watching it 52 years later, then yeah, you kind of clock that. So there's just that effort to put some depth and some gravitas and some seriousness into something that might just be seen as a run-of-the-mill pseudo-historical.
Should we wrap up with a bit of a fan question?
Shoot.
Would you be happy to see the monk coming back? I mean, we've already discussed what the distinction between him and the Master is, but I think there's room for a slightly more whimsical character who's not necessarily evil and is more...
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say really, because I don't know how durable the character really is in terms of. Oh, I'm not really sure how durable the Master is, to be honest. But it's
I could answer that.
Yeah, it's it's very specific to his situation here, but also his Butterworth's performance and how that performance riffs off Hartnell. That's the thing. It's almost to throw that sort of fan question back at you. That's very much a way of thinking about these kind of things that is sort of birthed here. That idea. I know we've seen a couple of appearances from the Daleks, that kind of thing. But I'm fully prepared to believe that this is just a sort of casual bit of invention for a show that was throwing out casual bits of invention every week. And it's only really with the benefit of hindsight that we sort of see how much later you could lock on to that kind of the dramatic potential of just remixing the central tenets of the show's format. That it's like it looks very different with hindsight. I'd be happy to see the monk again, but only if it's done as well as it's done here.
This is a great moment.
This is a moment where you see them go in, and from this little altar thing.
Yes.
And this is, of course, it's just brilliant. I think it's brilliant. And
They're good cliffhangers, aren't they? They really are.
Well,
all the way through this, great cliffhangers, and that's a cracker.
Yes.
He's got a TARDIS. Blooming heck.
Okay, so next tonight we are winding forward to 1977 and the Talons of Weng-Chiang, which was the final story of season 14. And something of an end of an era, I think, for Doctor Who. It's the final adventure birthed from the legendary creative team of script editor Robert Holmes, producer Philip Hinchcliffe. This is very much, your sort of creative dream team. Their last hurrah, working to a script from Robert Holmes, which, in a nutshell, sees the Doctor and Leela arrive in Victorian London and get dragged into an investigation of some missing girls, possibly which has something to do with the Palace Theatre and the artist in residence there, Chinese magician Li Sen Chang. What eventually transpires is that Chang is the servant of an angry ancient Chinese god called Weng-Chiang, who ultimately transpires to be a time traveller from the future, desperate to get back to where he came from. Quite a lot to talk about here, not least because I think this is one of those stories that has one of the kind of all-time great reputations, doesn't it? It's up there with your Blinks, your Genesis of the Daleks, your stories like that. People love this one. It is something of an unimpeachable classic in many people's eyes,
except for, of course, the elephant in the room or the giant rat in the room.
Except for the giant rat in the room.
Which, of course, is the racism, by which, of course, we're talking about Casey, the Irish stage
terrible stereotype of the Irish.
Is Irish, he's boozy, he's superstitious.
Hang on.
It's
not an out-and-out stereotype. He denies that he's been drinking, and Jago says, well, it's about time you started.
Before calling him a pixelated leprechaun.
Yes, I wrote that down as well.
Yes.
So it sounds like I'm being facetious to bring that up, rather than obviously the Chinese stereotyping.
I think it is the elephant in the room. I suppose I don't want to jump the gun too much in terms of just like overall laying my entire thoughts about this at the door, but this is really difficult to talk about simply because it's both simultaneously really good and really racist. And if it was really shit, it would be a lot easier to talk about because
you could just dismiss it all.
You could just dismiss it. But this is undoubtedly the work of a creative team at the top of their game. There is so much to admire here. There is so much to talk about, so much to like, and many of the things for which it is praised, I think it is praised justly so. But it is so racist, and it's not even just a little subtext to it. It's like throbbing radioactive, clear an area a mile around it kind of racist. That this is a tough one to discuss in 2016.
It kills it for me.
Yeah,
it really. I just think it's because let's start with the casting of John Bennett. Not, as far as I can tell, of any Asian extraction.
No.
And the thick set makeup. his cod accent.
It's full yellow face that he does it.
Oh, absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, and to the extent that Leela's
He does
given
the voice.
Leela's given the line at one point. The yellow one calls him Lord
Yeah.
with regard to Magnus Greel, the ultimate bad guy. He's on stage and he's saying things like he's going to do his next click, meaning his next trick, and then when he throws the cards up to Tom Baker, he says catchy.
Did you not think though there was a difference between Chang when he's himself and on stage he thickens it up somewhat to play up to that stereotype?
I think there's an element of that, but it's so ham-fistedly done.
It's just
the rest of the time.
The central proposition of his casting in that role. I mean, I sort of see where you're coming from, Jim, in that I did note that John Bennett, given the role that he is playing and the way he is playing it, does attempt to modulate his performance as Chang a bit, in that very much, the stage magician. There is, I think, consciously a sense that he's playing the exotic magician.
And certainly by the time you get to his death scene in the opium den, it's very clear that Bennett has attempted a nuanced performance.
He definitely has. And things like the sort of the panicked subservience in the scenes where he's in the cellar with Weng-Chiang versus just his sort of cold malevolence. There is an attempt, I think, at a nuanced performance. But I must confess, I mean, I've not watched this probably for about 16, 17 years, and I think a lot of the details were slightly hazy. And I genuinely couldn't remember whether we were supposed to buy that Chang is Chinese, genuinely Chinese, or whether he is, as there was a long tradition of at the time, British and American stage performers pretending to be Chinese as part of the act. I mean, there was magicians, especially, there's a whole chunk about this in that film and novel, The Prestige. The legendary Chinese magician of the early Victorian era in London, Chung Ling Soo, was an American guy. And I kept thinking partway through, Is the twist that he's actually a British guy and the Doctor will say, oh no, your name's William something, I've seen you, around. And then as we got into episodes 3 and 4 and he was talking about how Weng-Chiang had brought him up from a peasant in China and taken him over to London, it's like, and therein lies the problem. I mean, it's one of several big problems, but that's one that could have been so easily sidestepped in keeping with the period by
if
at
it
least
to
making
anybody,
him.
though, I think. For me, the race issue here, it's unfortunate that people weren't as sensitive to it at the time that this was being made 40 years ago. But that doesn't stop me enjoying it. I mean, I'm hoping the fact that, I say, it's unfortunate people weren't sensitive to it then. Nowadays, if you did this, it would be unacceptable. I'm hoping people just wouldn't do it. But then you have got precedents like, I think I tried to watch the Lone Ranger film the other night with Johnny Depp as Tonto.
That's pretty racist.
Which, I looked into that.
Oh, no, but he's so versatile.
Apparently his defence was he believes somewhere down in his ancestry he's got some Native American or something. Whatever. But I'm glad things like this are still around, because hopefully it means people now and in the future can look back and not just think, God, weren't people horrible then?
Well,
because we have to remember that the morality we have now isn't fixed and eternal, which I think a lot of people tend to think, oh, anyone who did this in the past or is from a different culture is just being evil. Whereas, your outlook on the world is very much affected by the culture you're growing up in. So I think
I
don't
agree
think
with
people
you.
making this were actively trying to be racist.
No.
I will qualify that with a few other things later. But to cast John Bennett, I just don't think it probably occurred to people that it was going to be a problem to do
absolutely
that.
Not.
Nowadays it would be.
I think, I'm going to say there's no malice in it. I think there is a little bit in places, but that comes with a big qualified remark. What I would say is that I think I sort of split the difference between the two of you in terms of where I stand on this. And I think, I looked... I had a hunch that Philip Sandifer might have something interesting to say about the race issue, and so I looked up his blog, and, sure enough, he does. The comparison he makes is sort of Huckleberry Finn, where he says that it's... it's sort of
great literature.
It belongs in that pantheon of things that are simultaneously great art and worth studying and worth understanding, and which have a lot of aspects to praise, but are undoubtedly very, very racist. And I think in terms of where I stand on this, I think it does deserve to be knocked off its pedestal in the pantheon of Doctor Who because of the race issue. But I think in terms of talking, I'm not saying that it is wall-to-wall shit, but I think it's so problematic that I think one of the things that a lot of fans claims they like to make about this kind of thing is that, like, someone like you could show Genesis of the Daleks to a non-fan and they would appreciate it as great art. There are stories of that ilk that sort of transcend their time, whereas this is not timeless. This is so date-stamped as a mid-70s.
But is that purely because of the racism?
I have a view that nothing is timeless. Everything is date-stamped with...
Everything's a product of its time.
Everything's a product of its era, and I think when people start trying to make
era.
claims for things being timeless, it's a very self-reflexive thing because people themselves are justifying why they're wasting time watching this old stuff when you could be enjoying new stuff. I think nothing is timeless. That's not a concept that exists. But what you can do is say that something is just great art that can be enjoyed on the level now that it could have been enjoyed on its first broadcast or first showing, which, you know, is undoubtedly the case for a great number of films and albums and TV shows. This can't. You can't sidestep the racism in this because it's suffused to the core.
No, but you can absolutely acknowledge it.
Yes.
And enjoy the good elements of it. And hopefully, like I say, appreciate that, okay, people were not sensitive at the time. And I think we might talk specifically about the individual incidents of racism in it. But I am, like I say, I'm happy to watch this and think, yeah, people weren't sensitive at that point, and we probably still aren't now. And probably people in decades will look back at stuff that we do now, you know. Just as a side thing, I mean, you'll probably be aware, is there a Channel 4 show called It Was Acceptable in the decade?
Friend of
I think
mine
the 70s was the first time they did, so you may not wish to speak too much about this.
I
remember watching that, and if you don't know it, it's basically getting lots of clips from shows from the 70s or whichever decade they cover, and getting some pundits to sit there and either wince, shake their head, or sit there with their mouths wide open, depending on whether it's racist, sexist, or hints around paedophilia a little bit.
Yes.
I just thought the fact that that's narrated by Matt Lucas, who does Little Britain, seems like a bizarre idea.
Yeah, and Come Fly With Me, which I think has some of the more egregious stereotyping in it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's the first and last time with a sort of 15-year window on either side that anyone had blacked up on British TV.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, for me, you see, I hate it when I sit here sort of sounding like the sort of pious, more politically correct than thou sort of person.
None of us want to be that guy, and I'm sure there will be people listening to this hitting fast forward going, these like metropolitan
Start
London
talking about
types.
Jago.
Like, yeah.
And but the point is,
Holmesy and double act. They haven't used that phrase yet.
But the thing is, I like a risque joke. I even like stuff that's pretty near the knuckle, regardless of whether it's sexist or racist or what have you, things that test boundaries or that make you question.
You don't need everything to have a sort of sanitising layer of oversensitivity about it.
No, but this doesn't have any knowing sense about it.
Absolutely not.
With the exception of maybe Chang doing his stage act, and I accept that is an extra layer on it, but generally throughout it, there isn't a layer of exploration of race. It isn't exploring race and using stereotypes to do that.
And I thought there would be at one point, actually, there was, which I noted down, and then it's sort of obliterated by everything else since, but there's the bit where the Doctor is riding in the back of the taxi cab, and Lightfoot says he talks about how the Chinese have fireworks at funerals, and he said odd custom, odd people, and then the Doctor stops the taxi outright and says that's the custom to ward off evil spirit, or they do this to ward off evil spirits, and then gets out the taxi cab. And the note that I made at that point was, this serial is unabashed at putting the prejudices, certainly of the Victorian era, up on screen, but the Doctor is sort of acting as a counterweight to that. But then he doesn't ever again. And to be honest, it's like, I gave up making lists of just the sheer volume of racist language that is used in this, even to the point where the Doctor himself starts getting in on the act.
That's my main problem
when he's ambushed and he says, "Oh, I love little surprises," which is like it's a racist joke. And there is so much. I had to rewind for the bit where Lightfoot says, "I've got two inscrutable chinks here," and I said, "Oh my God, surely I didn't hear that right," and rewound it. And it's like, it's for something that is, and this is where the malice aspect of it slightly comes into it, because this is so well written in terms of just the detail. There's not a word out of place. This is one of the most literary Doctor Who scripts ever. It's not like it's accidentally wandered down some linguistic cul-de-sacs. The pixelated leprechaun just being an example of one of the bits of racist language that is not aimed at the Chinese in this. It's like there is not a word out of place in this script, and yet the torrent of racist language that it contains,
that's exactly my point.
Really tough.
But that's exactly my point in terms of how you could... So with Casey, right, he's Irish and he's called a pixelated leprechaun, but he's very much portrayed as a sympathetic character.
Yes.
So the use of that language against him, although obviously...
And he gets a rebuttal and there's a bit of a joke. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing that if this was laced with that kind of thing,
yes,
then that would be an exploration, or there'd be a
bunch of heroic Chinese characters played by Chinese actors, for example.
Yeah,
yes.
But that's not what happens
No.
here. I think that's what makes it ultimately irredeemable from a modern perspective. But even taking what Jim has said into account with regard to, yes, of course, remembering that this is of its time in the same way that you might read... Though God knows why you'd want to, Mark Twain, quotations, yes, books, no. Or listen to Wagner, or whatever, and fine, that's fine. But for me, I think I would be that scintilla more forgiving if I thought that this was actually more than a plodding bit of Doctor Who. And I really don't think that this is as good as people say it is.
Oh, okay.
I think that the sets are beautiful. The atmosphere, just right from the TARDIS arriving in the fog with the beautiful cobbled streets, the sets are terrific. There's even a couple of bits of location work that are really, really effective. Everything is luscious. The homunculus, Mr. Sin, is a glorious piece of design and really sinister.
Really grotesque concept as well. Those bits at the end where he's like snorting like a pig because he has a pig's brain.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, there's a lot to point to and say that's good, but for me the 6 episodes felt really plodding. There's a lot of going from a drawing room to a living room to going from Lightfoot's dining room, going in a carriage from one place to another.
Yes.
It didn't zip along for me, and I think I watched this with you more than 10 years ago, Matt. So I'd seen it before. And yeah, for me, it doesn't really hold up as a... I don't feel at the end of it that we've understood anything more about the characters. I don't feel that the plot was so great that we forgive the lack of character development. Magnus Greel is a relatively interesting villain, I suppose, but at the end of the day, he's just a mad professor. He's a pretty by-numbers villain. I don't see much here apart from some great set design work, some excellent direction, and a few zinger lines. And then if you layer on top of that the irredeemable racism, I just don't see why this is such a classic.
Well, I suppose that's the thing. It's that it... I think there is a lot to praise, and I think, to be honest, it held my attention perhaps more than it did yours, with some caveats. But I think maybe it's just of an era where it was, as the phrase we've used before, the A-team just doing what they do really well. I mean, it's like all the elements are there for, they've got great designer, they've got great director, they've got great producer, they've got a writer who knows his way around a script with the aforementioned caveats, and I'm sure we'll come back to it. Tom Baker is, I think, in his prime here. I mean, he sort of strides that like a colossus. I think he's so, the camera loves him in this, I think. But it's almost, I mean, I think the bits of it that work really well can also be found in lots of other surrounding series that aren't distractingly racist.
Yeah, but my point, I suppose, is if park the racism.
Yes.
We have discussed it long enough, and I've already said that for me it kind of craters the whole thing. But even if you park that, I think that there are some great production elements here. But for me, it just doesn't hang together as a serial. I know that, for example, Jago and Lightfoot, Jago being the theatre impresario with some ideas slightly above his station, a great stock English sort of comic character, and Professor Lightfoot, the somewhat urbane, rather more stoical pathologist. They're often cited as some of the great one-time serial companions, and I think they've got some spin-off audio.
They've got 3 seasons worth of Big Finish.
I don't think there's really anything in particular there to... Yeah, it's a couple of nice...
They're 2 nice performances.
But I don't see that... I don't get the fan outcry that they haven't been back or anything like that. I just don't see... And again, just parking the racism, I just don't see, other than the high production values, what's really... I'm looking for narrative, and I don't really see anything... We don't learn anything about the characters. There isn't some fantastic, clever, Blink-like plot that somehow neatly jigsaws together in a way that makes you feel really satisfied.
Thank God.
No, but you know what I mean, right? There's not a character thing. There's not a plot thing. So what is it?
I agree with a lot of those points. I mean, your initial one, this is going back a little bit, of it plods. I've always felt that, but I know I'm comparing something serious with something frivolous. But in the same way that with the race, which we will park, we're looking at it from a Bond's perspective. We were never meant to watch this as a 2.5-hour film. You know, I'm very happy with the idea. It was just good production values
over 6 weeks.
I
think some of the same plotting defects as a lot of six-parters.
Indeed, and I think Robert Holmes has come up with something good, and in order to address that fact, and even though I agree with you, I'm not sure why people are so enamoured with Jago and Lightfoot as a double act, and it's a real shame Holmes carried on doing those double acts, although arguably the ones in Carnival of Monsters probably predate it.
Yeah.
It feels like Robert Holmes knows this is 6 episodes, this is where most of the budget of the season's going because of the production values are so fantastic. How are we going to make sure this doesn't drag too much? And that's probably why Jago and Lightfoot sort of come into their own a bit. Is it about episode 5 or something? They have their business with the dumbwaiter and whatnot.
That's when
they meet. They don't meet till episode 5.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, even though I'm not that taken with them, I think that's a good way of getting around the fact that it's just going to be padding. It's to put the spotlight somewhere else for a little while. But I will just go back to the production values. They are absolutely fantastic. And I can't believe that dragon at the end, the gold dragon, I think it's just made from
huge,
polystyrene.
Yeah.
With a heated wire to kind of sculpt it. It's absolutely fantastic, you know. And yeah, Mr. Sin is a fantastic little grotesque
really
creation.
Yeah.
Oh, and just to address your point about Magnus Greel, I think that was probably because he's underdeveloped, is because it was originally going to be the Master.
Oh.
Straight off the back of Deadly Assassin, and all the clues are there about the body falling to pieces and stuff.
I know that.
And I think just later on they decided, no, make it just a time traveller. So
I think it's slightly more interesting now. And it's one of the things that I thought, you know, again, because, you know, Robert Holmes knows his way around how to put a script together. It's there's something that the echo of his work that you see most in Russell T Davies, I think, is in a lot of the kind of little bits of detail. So, you know, the implied details about the war between China and Iceland in the 51st century.
Yeah, and the Filipino advance on Reykjavik.
Yeah,
yes,
fantastic.
of which, the Greel, the butcher of Brisbane, was sort of one of the and
that's very Nightmare Child, or could have been King.
It
the stuff
sums
that
up the whole
like
world.
you were saying, the stuff that
there's
RTD
also a
picks
kind
up.
of an international outlook to that, which is, you know, ironically, in one of the most racist Doctor Who stories I've ever seen, but there's a kind of international outlook there that you don't often kind of see in kind of
and acknowledges
somewhat
the power shifts around
somewhat
quite a bit.
parochial, classic series Doctor Who. But also I like an interesting idea that, again, is just sort of thrown out there and not especially developed, but that Magnus Greel is from a future Dark Age, which is a fascinating concept, which especially, you know, don't know across the board what the politics of our listeners are, but, you know, it's like, I would suspect that a number of people are going into 2017 sort of quite worried about where things are going. You know, the idea of a future Dark Age as opposed to a sort of gleaming sci-fi vision of the future where everything gets better is it's, you know, it's a throwaway line, but it's an interesting one.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, whether that's meant to be they don't physically have the hardware, or it's the knowledge has been lost, or whatever.
Or just the implication that things go backwards is
perhaps let me talk about some of the things I did like, so that I don't sound like less of a deliberately contrarian arse.
But we're under no obligation to praise the Talons of Weng-Chiang, seeing as it has been praised on an almost daily basis by anyone writing a Doctor Who thing since the 70s. So.
But I mean, I do think that there were some terrific bits of business in terms of the dialogue.
Some zinger dialogue.
And most notably where Holmes is writing Londoners. The sort of cod Cockney with a nod and a wink. The old crone.
The old crone was the one.
The old crone who was with the policeman when they find the body in the river in episode 1.
Yeah.
Never seen anything like it in all my puff.
Yeah.
So that kind of stuff that I think is amazing. And then, you know, in episode 4, I think it's episode 4 when Jago comes across the lair in the basement and is muttering to himself about the fact that he could offer tours of the lair of the Phantom, a bob a knob, that kind of stuff.
Oh, and then later when he says
"Heavens to Betsy,"
when they get to Magnus Greel's base, and Jago is sort of suggesting that maybe they should just go for a drink around the corner, and he says, "Why don't we go and decorate the mahogany?" Yeah,
terrific stuff. You know what? I do actually quite like the interaction between Jago and Lightfoot when they're planning their escape from the dumbwaiter, and Jago's sort of consideration of his courage or lack thereof, and then he obviously manages to be courageous by flapping his arms about in episode
That's
6.
a nice moment, and it also ties into a much earlier nice moment that I like the interplay between Jago and the Doctor, wherein Jago is all bluster and courage and he's a man's man, and the way he presents himself to Casey is that very much he's preparing to be the hero of the hour. But the Doctor knows this, but kind of plays on it slightly. So it's the bit where they're in the theatre and Jago says, presumably you've got the place surrounded by reinforcements. And the Doctor says, no, Mr. Jago, when the time comes, you and I shall face our destiny shoulder to shoulder.
Yeah, his bravado slips.
And you just see his face fall at the idea of that, which is nice. But then that's the thing. Holmes knows, there's not much flesh on the bone, but when combined with a good performance, Holmes's gift for dialogue means that it all kind of really, it does sing. And there's a pace to how everyone talks. I mean, it's so dense and it's so literary in terms of how it's written that, it's genuinely dazzling. And you sort of think, I've criticised a lot Moffat banter, quote unquote, for a sort of artificial, heightened, stylised, jokey way in which people talk. And Holmes here, for the most part, pulls off that trick, but in a way that just goes the extra mile in terms of how literary it is, that it's genuinely impressive. But that then again brings me back to the fact that I don't think the torrent of racist language is accidental, because there's not a word out of place everywhere else. Sorry to bring it back to that.
We did talk about the high production values and the fact that they probably reserved quite a bit of the budget from this season to do these episodes. The director is David Maloney. Now, I think it does drag a bit, particularly through episodes 3 and 4. It's usually episode 4 that's a bit of a drag, isn't it? So, I mean, fair enough. But in terms of the direction, I mean, there are some interesting shots. It's blended well, the location work with the studio stuff. Does Maloney have any particular history? Was there anything else he directed?
Well, yeah, Deadly Assassin as well, Genesis of the Daleks. He's generally regarded as the sort of big director of this era.
Yeah, because he it certainly feels like there's a strong hand on it, doesn't it?
This may be his last Doctor Who directing job.
Oh, really?
I think. I might be wrong. We've not reviewed the 2 stories before this, but going back to you saying you've read the Sandifer blog on this.
Yes.
In order to kind of get away from the racism, he starts going on about how sexist it is as well. Yeah, we've not reviewed the 2 stories before this, Face of Evil and Robots of Death, which are Leela's first 2 stories, both written by Chris Boucher. But yeah, the complaint from Philip Sandifer here is that she suddenly goes from being a very confident character who's doing something new to she kind of becomes a stock girl in peril in this. She's talking her sort of this is a good knife kind of talk, but she's getting captured and screaming, I think.
Yes, there's a big scream when she encounters the very...
Well, it is a very convincing rat.
Very cuddly giant.
I find her portrayal, and this is no slight to Louise Jameson, who I think does the best with what she's given. The characterization in this is very confused. So on the one hand, as you said, there's this is a good knife. But at the same time, as you say, she becomes something of a peril monkey. And that's, it's a bit confused, isn't it?
I think it sort of points to a problem that they certainly have, in the classic era, and I don't think they've ever really tried it to any great extent in the modern era. But it's what you might term the Katerina problem, which is if you introduce a character whose background is so specific, there's therefore a limit to how versatile that character can be.
If their culture's so different to the audiences, everything's going to have to be explained.
And this is the thing, it's like it's a great way introducing a character like Leela, who, is great for her first couple of stories, and
Invisible Enemy, of course, that was reviewed.
Of course. But especially when seen on her own turf, she's a very interesting character. Her reasons for travelling with the Doctor are in and of themselves sort of dramatically fruitful. But you get the impression that when this crops up, there's been little thought given to further down the line. I think they make some effort into sort of pretending that she, into at least trying to address the fact that her cultural outlook is going to be very different to that of the audience. But there's a limit where if you're, if it was the adventures of and use this term lightly, but quote-unquote savage in everyday modern London, for example, that would mean that you could peel off those layers of the character very well. But in a series where you're exploring a completely new and alien environment every week for the audience, to then have to consider what the ramifications are for that for the audience, and then also for this character who is in all of themselves alien, ultimately something is alwa's going to give. And that's why characters like that aren't a terribly good idea.
Hinchcliffe did say he was thinking of introducing stuff that would suggest story on story. Leela was learning things and trying to educate herself.
But you have to commit to that as your major arc for the season, as opposed to...
And of course, Hinchcliffe was, I'm going to say, kind of unceremoniously dumped after this story.
He was, yes.
This was the era of Mary Whitehouse, and pretty much Holmes and Hinchcliffe had overstepped the mark enough that they'd been pulled up short a little bit. So.
Well, it is really violent, this, as well. It's like both implied and in terms of actual on-screen violence. I mean, there's not... And it's a violence of ideas as well, and it's violence of, grotesquerie. I mean, it's just that idea of... I mentioned it earlier. I mean, I really like it as a sort of really squishy, grotesque idea, but that idea that Mr. Sin is the body of an automaton with the cerebral cortex of a pig inserted, and then what you have at the end, he's like oinking and squealing because he's a pig gone mad in a robot body or something. I mean, that's horrible.
That should have been the tagline on it. Played by Deep Roy, who's fantastic. I think his actual voice, because he was very much a go-to man for that kind of role. He's like the Jimmy V of his day.
Latterly achieved some stardom as playing all of the Oompa Loompas in...
But he's got a couple of great roles in Blake 7. If you get the chance to see the Clute, where he's Blake 7 episode Gambit, when he plays the Clute, who's this kind of phenomenal gambler who's so good he makes Paul Darrow spit noodles out. And later in Moloch, where he plays a kind of Cyclops hipster chicken man.
Brilliant.
Keep an eye out.
Yeah.
But ultimately, yes, okay, Tom Baker is at the height of his powers, and yes, Hinchcliffe and Holmes have got something of a lock on this sort of Gothic era.
They're in a purple patch, aren't they?
Yeah, and the Hammer stuff is coming through as well.
Yeah.
The clan d'oeil, the allusions to that. But ultimately, and we've not even really mentioned Sherlock Holmes, but this is a sort of Holmes pastiche to the degree, of course, famously that Tom Baker himself wears as a cape and deer stalker. It's an era that is hidebound by a poor choice of companion for the reasons that you have said. There isn't an iconic villain. It doesn't have a memorable plot. What you're left with is a Sherlock Holmes pastiche with incredible production values and a couple of decent character actor performances. And I don't think, as Doctor Who fans, that we should just celebrate because there are eras of the show where it was done a bit on the cheap. We can't just say this is great because there are some great production values. I think this is quite a plodding, go nowhere piece of work that doesn't develop the characters and doesn't have a zinger of a plot that keeps your attention. So then you're left with, well, it looks great, but if you layer on top of that the unforgivable racism, certainly from a modern perspective, I just don't see why people love it so much.
That's a fair point.
I mean, that's the thing. I think I would agree that I think this era is overpraised, and I think on our sort of dips into it, it is clearly made by people who know how to make TV drama really, really well, and that has not always been universally the case. And so I think it is justly praised for being pretty good, well-made TV week in, week out. That said, I would agree that I think it doesn't totally escape a lot of the Doctor Who procedural problems that I think bedevil less good eras. It is the era of the pastiche, and a pastiche of a generally quite a small number of sources, sort of Victoriana, Gothic, and Hammer horror. I find this era, I can't deny that it's well made, and I enjoyed the stories for the most part as a result, but I find this era, I think, less inventive and less exciting than certainly the Hartnell era, but also I would say the Pertwee era as well, where I think there's a lot more going on. But yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I think this held my attention maybe more than it did yours, John, and I enjoyed it. But ultimately, I think you can't watch this in 2017 and not talk about the racism, and that can't not be the deal breaker, I think. And ultimately, it is for me. It's so racist that's a deal breaker.
Shooting Deep Roy on overscale set pieces, doing multiple motion control passes on him to replicate him and to put him into, the shots in numerous different positions.
So you can imagine it's an organisational headache, replicating him numerous times. I mean, in some plates, I think we have 56 or 57 repeat passes of Deep Roy in order to make up that one shot. So you can imagine how shoot-intensive this all was.
He had a lot of work to do because he literally did, every time you see him, he did it. He did that.
So our final story tonight, the 11th Hour, which was broadcast on the 3rd of April 2010. Made some notes, look.
Good detail.
Yeah, thanks, mate. It's obviously Matt Smith's first proper story, because he did feature for about 20 seconds at the end of, what was it?
It's his
end
first
of time.
story.
It's his
first full story.
All right. But yeah, so he's so the 10th Doctor has regenerated into Matt Smith. The TARDIS has gone haywire and it crash lands in
the village of Ledworth.
In the village of Ledworth, which
in the year.
There's the rub.
Oh,
yeah.
Now I don't know.
5 years before it turns up.
No,
again.
12
years.
Oh,
well, no, and then 2 years at the end. So those, if we assume that the present day in, sorry, I've jumped all over you here, but if we assume the present day in this era of Doctor Who is the era in which it was broadcast, those opening scenes are set in 1996.
But, time probably gets rewritten. And
probably does, timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly.
Sort of thing, so whatever.
I'm just saying in 1996 they certainly wouldn't have had a hospital as well resourced as the one they clearly have.
That bit is set
that bit is set in 2010, isn't it?
No, in 2008.
Oh, is it?
Because then if you clock at the end, it's been another 2 years when he comes back in the year before the wedding.
Oh, well, that makes sense. They would have had about 11 years of quality funding by that point.
John has rolled his trousers up to his knees for some reason.
Yeah,
is this a thing you do?
We went deep on this quite quickly, didn't we? Do you want to finish describing the plot?
Yeah, so he crash lands in this little girl's garden and has a chat with her, and they get on. He's in some post-regenerative funk, so he wants to eat weird shit. She cooks him some food, and then he says, "Oh, I'm just going to nip back to the flat." Comes back out of the TARDIS, and it's years later, and there's a hole in a wall, and it's a hole in time, and there's a prisoner that's escaped from a prison through the hole and is causing havoc in this little English village. Obviously, it's as the season opener for season 5, it is written by Stephen Moffat, who by this point, of course, was the showrunner.
This is his first script as showrunner, isn't it? Yeah.
And I think it's well known to both of our listeners that we're not necessarily...
That joke about us having 2 listeners is well known to both of our listeners.
Yeah,
well.
Exactly. They love it. But yeah, so it's well known to our listeners, I think, that we're not necessarily...
We don't love this era, do we?
Sort of not one of the three of us, I think, particularly loves the Matt Smith era, though to varying degrees we blame his performance or not. I think his performance is great. I think he never tops this performance, and that's probably one of my main problems with him, is that he peaks.
I'm going to come right out and say it. I think this is my favourite episode of the Matt Smith era.
Yes, mine too.
I think this is probably the most positive we may be, actually. Yeah, no, I really enjoyed this. Yeah.
I think this is terrific.
A few grumbles, but no, I think generally it does a really fantastic job. I mean, not to be too cruel to John's very thorough build-up, but the plot's essentially Smith and Jones, isn't it? There's an escaped alien criminal, and there's a over-officious alien police force who are going to wipe out
It's modern
everybody.
Doctor Who procedural.
Yeah, but as we said with sort of School Reunion, that plot's not necessarily, well, it isn't the important thing. It's more about what the story's going to be, what the episode's going to do, which is introduce Matt Smith, the new companion, the whole new era. And yeah, no, I completely agree with you. Matt Smith's really good here. It's a weird thing to, even if you are fully aware of what happens afterwards, you can watch these things kind of as if you're watching them for the first time with that same feeling.
I kept wanting to see this Doctor develop.
Yeah, and I was excited watching
then what we got is Series 5.
I was excited watching the trailer at the end of all the other exciting things which are going to be happening. Hey, this looks fantastic.
Yeah, I had exactly the same thought, Jim. It's funny you should say that. No, and there is something, I really want to get to grips with this in the time that we have allotted. What is it about the characterization and the performance in this that so does work when it so quickly doesn't quite... Matt?
I just raised my hand there because I'd like to field this one, because I've been thinking about this a lot.
Yeah, go on.
I think partly the enjoyment of this episode is almost just like the failed promise. It sets up a lot of really interesting dynamics. I think it sets up Amy brilliantly. I think it sets this Doctor up brilliantly. It sets up a tone for the series that is a huge break from the Russell T Davies tone, and it sets that up very well. And that feels very, after much as I love the Russell T Davies era, we've seen all the tricks that he had in the bag by the end of the Series 4 and the specials, and he'd done a very good job of dismantling everything he'd done and leaving an open playing field. And then suddenly, you've got, it's not like an alien crisis in modern-day London with a celebrity cameo, although Patrick Moore's in it briefly. It's a little Avengers-style village and sort of a weird sort of fairy tale, and the cinematography is different, and, you know, it feels fresh and new and exciting, and you're so excited about where it's going to go. And for me, that's the real disappointment of the era, is that I think it gets off to such a killer start, but I think to break down what so often frustrates me about Stephen Moffat is that he writes clever ideas that then he has to undergo an enormous number of contortions and character distortions and things in order to think his way out of. And this is a very simple setup. The Doctor's relationship with Amy here and the role he plays in her life is fascinating and intriguing and holds so much promise. And I genuinely think the opening scenes with the little girl version of Amy in the 90s are probably one of the best things Moffat has ever written. I love those scenes, and it's just simply that almost all that's interesting about this episode is then subsequently ignored or just muddled up in a way that there's just so much latent potential here that it just goes unexplored, I think.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, it is a break from the RTD stuff, which I must say I didn't particularly notice at the time. I think I was expecting a much bigger break, whereas now, because you know how it went on, that's much more obvious. Because it does start with, as John says, TARDIS crashing into this garden. The fact that the garden's overgrown. Has it got a little beehive and things in there and stuff, you know?
Yeah.
The whole thing feels like his Moffat's setting out his stall as he's going to be working around in the world of Neil Gaiman, Studio Ghibli, and this kind of little girl lost storybook thing, which actually is a line of dialogue in there almost, isn't it?
Yeah.
At one point.
And Caitlin Blackwood's performance as the little girl is terrific.
It's lovely.
I'm not actually that keen on it. I've
Oh,
got to
really?
say, no, but I'm not going to be cruel to a child. I'm going to say actress. I'm not being mean. I don't know if she was an actress like that. I don't think she. I think she's Karen Gillan's cousin or something.
They are
Didn't
related.
they only
yes.
find that out after they'd been cast
I don't
or something? Well,
So
I think
go
she's
to
a better
town on
actress
it.
than Karen Gillan. But
I'm not going to disagree with that. But no, Matt Smith is really fantastic in this. And I think to answer that question, where did it go after this? I think the problem is probably of all the stuff that he does here, and he's all over the shop, it probably very quickly focuses with Matt Smith, with the performer and with the writers, of which bits do we like best, what does the audience respond to, and it just narrows down to bits of business. Whereas here I'll be very happy to keep watching this Doctor, and even at the end when he gets, I've never been very keen on his outfit, but it kind of looks all right here by the end. I'm excited about it.
Was this the first episode they filmed?
It was bits of this and also the Angels two-parter that we looked at a few months ago.
Yeah.
I think the first of the Angels episodes, the beach scenes on that were the first thing
because
that
that's
they
when they
filmed
revealed his outfit, or it got leaked
in total. But yeah, they sort of did the two in parallel, because all three of those episodes are the only three directed by Adam Smith.
Well, I want to say something about that. For me, watching this, and this was really the first time it had come to my attention, I kept going back to Spearhead from Space. Not only are there the obvious parallels, the fact that he picks up his clothing from the hospital changing room, which is a direct lift from Spearhead from Space.
And also Paul McGann.
Oh, of course, from the TV movie, yeah. But then there's also the fact that, as with Spearhead from Space, which was done for slightly production, but it seems like the vast majority of 11th Hour is also filmed on location, or at least it feels like that. There's a lot of location work in it.
A lot of outdoor stuff, yeah.
Yeah, which is true also of Spearhead from Space. It's got those particular things going on. And what you see with Spearhead is there are threads, there are ideas, there are production things that aren't really picked up. The formula is, but there are threads that aren't then seeded
through the Pertwee era,
largely in production rather than narrative terms. Now, here, it's almost like it's the other way around. There are sort of narrative threads that aren't really picked at. Yes, okay, the fact that the Doctor had a big impact on her childhood is played with to an extent, but the psychological impact of that isn't really properly played with in season 5, I think.
Not at all. And I think this is a big problem, because I think Amy's angry cynicism makes sense here, and the sort of confusion and, and the fact that clearly, she's known for these issues in her town. The fact that Annette Crosby's character and the Rory and everyone pick out the fact
and Jeff, is it Jeff? You get this sense that he's building this village and that they're all sort of going to be part of this universe of people who, oh my God, it's him. he does exist.
Yeah.
And the sort of the cat's out of the bag and the story's out.
And that's one of the strands of this that I really like, is everyone sort of, when he turns up in the costume and everyone goes, oh, it's the Doctor, we thought you were mad. And Rory saying, like, you made me dress up as him when we were kids. And that is almost, I think, never picked up again.
Not
at
really,
all.
no. I mean, they go back to Ledworth, but there isn't that sense of... They go through the cast of characters like they're... and I don't mean this in a bad way, but like they're almost Cluedo characters. So there's the retired colonel, almost, the bluff guy who says, she says, go and get coffee. And there's the dotty aunt.
Who's the dude who gets, like, when she shuts the Doctor's tie
Yeah, that's
in
the
the
guy I
car
meant.
door? He's great. And he says, Amy, I'm going to need my car back at some point.
Yeah,
which
exactly.
is such a great line.
And it's quite nice the way that English village is kind of portrayed as comforting and stifling at the same time.
It's very Avengers-ish, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Oh, it's in that great artificial English village.
Yeah.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah, that's terrific. And then, as you mentioned, the director, Adam Smith, some of the stuff about the Doctor's heightened sense of awareness or heightened sensory skills, almost quasi-superpowers, but like when he clocks that Rory's not looking at the sun being blacked out, but he's looking at the guy with the dog, which I could explain now.
Yeah,
we
get Doctor Vision, which is a load of Polaroid snaps sort of animated together.
Yeah, but you get this sense that he's got a heightened awareness or that's going to be his thing. And again, that's a strand that's never ever picked up again.
No, I'm glad it isn't. I mean, I think we get enough from dialogue with that. That was quite an irritating scene.
Yeah, but I'm not saying you need the scene, Jim. I'm just saying that there's a thing there about him having heightened awareness.
Yes, he'll notice the tiniest detail in the room.
And almost sort of Sherlockian deductive reasoning capability that isn't then picked up again. His manic performance, it's not simply camp and kooky. There's something like his brain is fizzing too fast. And again, that it just becomes camp and kooky.
Yeah, there's real still there. The fact that when he's with the young Amy and she mentions very early on there's a crack in my bedroom wall. Are you here to have a look at it? And then they go into all the food business, and then the doctor's the one that raises it, and he says something like, you're absolutely fearless. So the fact that you're terrified by this crack in your wall must mean that it's really worth seeing. There's a kind of perceptiveness there that you sort of feel is a bit missing later on.
Absolutely.
But I think the main problem, though, is that... And I was sort of trying to think... I mean, for me, there's one real bum note that this strikes, which is the kissogram business, which is a joke that is sort of unearned to Amy's expense. It's like, it's not a career anyone has these days. I sort of rather like the idea that she was a policewoman, perhaps investigating a crime, and that was how they meet.
But she's obviously not even a kissogram, is she? No. She's a stripper.
It's which is a sort of unsavoury thing to sort of throw in.
Yeah, why? What is the point of that?
Yes.
And also...
In a town that seemingly wouldn't demand one.
And having praised the direction, the lingering shot when you first see her up her... legs to her tiny little skirt. It's unseemly, isn't it?
It's crass. But in some ways, I mean, setting aside the kind of the sexist undertones of that, part of the problem with it is, and the reason why the character of Amy, to my mind, never works, is that because he never gets a handle on... Because he can never get a handle on his characters, he sort of reinvents what they are week on week without ever really sort of building any sense of emotional complexity to it. So, I mean, I think Amy and Rory are these two characters who are potentially quite likeable in terms of how they're portrayed here, and certainly Amy has a more psychologically interesting story, I think, than what I think by that point had become the stock person of humble origins raised up by the Doctor, which is the Russell T Davies approach. There's something potentially interesting there, but over the next 2 years, Amy is not only the person who had her imaginary friend come true, who everyone thought was mad, but she then also becomes, the grieving mother, all of these kind of extra layers.
The surrogate mother.
Yeah, all of these layers are sort of built on without any consequences. And it's almost like he sort of... I always think the kind of big example of this would be Rory at the end of Series 5, who, I mean, isn't the implication that somehow he guards over Amy for 2,000 years?
Yeah, he's a sort of Auton centurion.
Which is fine.
And
I mean,
maybe is or isn't afterwards.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. And it's sort of for the sake of a clever idea that gets him, or indeed for a cheap joke that kind of gets him out of a bind. Moffat continually turns these characters on a dime to a point where they never feel like psychologically real people. And that's a real frustration because I think, from what I understand, he started writing this script a lot earlier than he needed to because he wanted to really get his first episode of Doctor Who right.
I think from the writer's tale, he has
a bit of correspondence
before Russell T Davies is finished.
Yes, there's a bit of correspondence with Davies about how he'd already started writing the first episode. And I'm going to say it shows because I think there is a sense to which just the psychological makeup of everyone involved and what their motivations are and how they interact is very fully realised and is very well thought out.
Well, there's a lot going on about childhood loss. Loss experienced as a child. So she doesn't have any, apart from when they burst into Annette Crosby's house, you don't see her aunt. Her parents are clearly are dead, right? Obviously, adults are disappointing. They're not reliable. So even the Doctor, you get a sense that it's not even necessarily the Doctor having left her in the lurch and only come back 12 years later. Adults constantly disappear and disappoint and say one thing and do another. And I think from a child's perspective, that's quite an interesting thing to play with. And the psychological impact on her, she says she's been through 4 psychiatrists and all the rest of it. None of that comes back. And she increasingly just becomes an idea. Yes. Amy, rather than a character. And I know we said this before, but the main problem I have, and I don't think this is at all wholly her fault, because I think it's mostly Moffat's fault. You can't polish a turd. But Gillan doesn't, I'm sorry to say, have the acting chops to at least make this ill-written character engaging.
No, I'd agree. I mean, but to be honest, I think she's fine here. I don't mind her performance in this episode. I mean, I don't think there's anything particularly...
She has no chemistry with Arthur Darvill, though.
Who's great, even in this relatively small role, I was keen for us to not be too anti-Moffat, actually. It's a kind of shame.
Why not? This is a terrific episode, and that's the thing that really lets it down, is it's that almost that kind of failed promise that...
This has huge wit and drive.
He can deliver the goods.
In 65 minutes, he lays out the mythos of the era. I think he undermines it through poor choices and over-clever thinking and then having to get himself out of knots all the time, which is the problem, as you described it, Matt. But in this, he sets up the mythos of the entire era and delivers us a whiz-bang adventure with a bit of CGI monsters and stuff, and Olivia Colman being Olivia Colman and being rather wonderful in a cameo role, all in 65 minutes. The whole mythos of the show, the young Amelia, Amy Pond growing up into this confused, psychologically disturbed person, introducing us to a whole cast of characters, sadly, many of whom we never see again, from the village.
But and
a story.
We've talked about this in the past as well.
He's done a great job.
One of his great strengths, even in episodes of his that I like a lot less, is his ability with just an image or an idea that will have a visual impact. And this is completely stuffed full of them. It's variations on the same trick. But when we first see Prisoner Zero as the guy with the dog, and the guy is just growling, but then the way it's shot, the guy and the dog, they just move their heads the same way,
in sync,
which is really funny, but also kind of spooky and scary. But then also when you've got the when it's Olivia Colman and the 2 kids, and then the child starts talking in Olivia Colman's voice, and she says, "Oh, if I let it slip again," that's wonderful.
There's not really anywhere else to go with this, but I just thought I'd throw it in. I'm so happy that it's a regeneration story when the Doctor's not flat on his back for most of the story.
Yes, he's not incapacitated, and I like the fact as well that he says, once he acknowledges, he says, "This is too much too soon. I'm not ready for this."
Yeah,
but that's also such a lovely line as well, isn't it? About if you consider. I know it's cruel to bring up something from the Colin Baker era, but you sort of anything from the Twin Dilemmas kind of tortured explanations for why the Doctor's a bit erratic, like
for the whole of his reign.
For the whole of his reign, but just the economy with which I noted it, just because I think it's not even a particularly clever line, but it really jumped out at me when she says. The little Amy says something like, "Are you always like this?" And he says, "Don't know, I'm still cooking," which is just great, because that's exactly what a regeneration story is going to be.
Well, I think, to come back to my question at the beginning, what is it about the characterization that works here that I feel doesn't necessarily work later on? I think there's an initial dismissive-ness, and not quite coldness, but there's a dismissiveness and a sharp wit. You're Scottish, fry something, or you've had some cowboys in here.
Oh, that's a great line.
That kind of thing, which is drier than some of the stuff he gets later, where he's just the sort of the camp
The banter machine.
Yeah, and he's all arms racing around and being very nice and full of bonhomie, with a bit of anger thrown in. But there isn't that wry sense of a real mind. When he says you're Scottish, fry something, it's one of the few times I can think of in the Matt Smith era, and I do generally think he's a good actor, but it's one of the few times you really get a sense of him as a person rather than, hey guys, it's Matt Smith as the Doctor.
And I think it's interesting that you picked that up, because a line that I noted down at the end, which I think carries real weight, is when Amy's in the TARDIS and they're about to jet off, and Amy says something like, why do you think I'm going to come with you? And he says, you're the Scottish girl in the English village and you never lost the accent, of course you're going to move on. Which is, A, incredibly deft as a bit of characterisation, but B, let's not forget, Stephen Moffat is a Scottish writer based in London, working for, what is effectively like the London, or indeed Welsh in Doctor Who's case, television industry. And I do feel there's some sort of, I don't know, for me that line jumped out as being personal in a way that I think Moffat's writing actually never is personal. I think it's very depersonalised. I think it's a lot of showing off, about showing what I can do, not who I am. And for some reason, I might just be reading too much into that line, but it really cut through for that reason of that feels like a very adept way of showing that you understand how someone ticks, that line, in a way that we don't often get much of a sense of later. And to be honest, it's a real, again, it's just a real shame, because I really like that side of him.
I think as well that it's not just that there's also some real wit in the dialogue. He largely started out as a sitcom writer, didn't he? With Chalk and with coupling. But I don't find generally that his zingers land for me. But there's a couple here, perhaps speaks to my proclivities, that I think they sound quite RTD-esque. But the one that really landed for me was when the Atraxi, the bad guy villains who've got the prisoner saying, Prisoner Zero will show himself, or the human residents will be incinerated, and it plays on everything. And they go by the ice cream van, and the Doctor says something, are they all playing that? And the ice cream guy says, it was meant to be Clair de Lune.
Yeah. Wrapping things up, I did mention at the start of this that I was still quite excited to watch the season 5 trailer at the end of this. Did you have similar feelings, even though you know what those stories wind up at? It does seem like a really good selection box of
absolutely, because one
images.
thing I would say is that I think the direction of Doctor Who took a massive upward tick with the Moffat era. I thought he brought on some fantastic directors, and I consistently of the opinion that I think it's a real shame that Adam Smith never got asked back. But also, that's the thing, his sort of that kind of trailer plays to his strengths as a writer, because it's little snippets of great ideas and images and all these kind of things that really bamboozle you and think, well, this is going to be great. I'd completely forgotten that Series 5 has got that, which is such a brief thing, isn't it, in the Pandorica Opens, but the kind of Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, Cyberman kind of thing, which is great. It looks fantastic.
I'm going to say I think season 5 is still my favourite of the Matt Smiths, for the reason that they've not really bolted down what they're going to do with it yet. It does feel like a much fresher season.
Absolutely.
No, I was going to say the only bit that really I really enjoyed that trailer too, and I really enjoyed the 11th Hour, and I don't think there is a better episode of the Matt Smith era. But the one bit that really stuck, sort of the one bit that really made my heart sink, was when Olivia Colman is on the roof saying, the Pandorica will open and silence will fall. And I was thinking,
the thing is, I don't. It's only but that's only a hindsight thing of a reminder.
Oh no,
of
it
where
totally
it's
is.
Go, because to be honest, I remember thinking it was just that was this year's Bad Wolf, basically, or something, or Torchwood, or whatever.
Yeah, I agree. No, I agree. It's absolutely in retrospect. I remember even at the time being intrigued, but yeah, that quickly wore off.
Well, yeah, no, the idea that we'd still be teasing out how a bunch of these issues resolve themselves some 3 or 4 years later would be extraordinary. But then, that's the thing. As I mentioned earlier, I watched the first episode of the new series of Sherlock last night, and that opened with a previously recap of something that we'd seen on TV over 2 years ago. So it's like, oh, Christ, okay.
That was my immediate take.
Get on with it.
And just before we go, we've mentioned him many times. I think Murray Gold ups his game a bit here. I really love his 11th Doctor theme, and we get a kind of full version of it here with his time signature and an organ
and drums
stuff
and a bit of guitar.
He really does a brilliant bit of work here, and some of the
really
early
pulls
stuff with Amelia is good as well. Very atmospheric. No, he really does up his game. I agree. Yeah.
I watched this in 2010 and loved it, and was very excited for what was to follow. And I had all the same feelings today watching it again, even though I kind of know that what was to follow wasn't really to my taste. But I mean, it's, you know, and I'm sure we can pull apart the reasons behind the failure of that further down the line. But I'm, you know, start of a new year, I'm quite happy to toast this as a really good episode.
Yeah, good luck, Chibnall.
Dear Sir, one evening, many years ago in Glasgow, I noticed a series of round balls travelling round 3 walls of a room. Whatever was causing the images, about 3 or 4 inches in diameter, I looked and could discover nothing. Then I noticed that stars in the sky were fading, and that as they faded, my balls disappeared. Stars were round. How is it that everyone thinks them pointed? Well, those are some of the many thousands of letters that I've had since I started going on the air and talking about astronomy, which is a good many years ago now. And at least these letters were written by people of independent thought, people who weren't shackled by the strings of convention.
Okay, so that wraps things up for January.
Hope we've helped stave off the January blues.
Oh, on which note?
You
miserable
can play the
January.
blues.
You can, those
keep
of you
them
not...
spinning.
Well, in fact, no, even if you are doing dry January, but even if you're not doing... In fact, especially if you're not... Basically, come and drink booze with us.
Yes, please do.
Sorry, I'm
and John,
skirting around the issue.
Yes. So, as you may remember, we have our listener drinks in London. John, what date?
Saturday, 28th of January. At
What time?
3 p.m.
What venue?
The Blue Posts. Now, see, we've had this
Which
discussion...
Blue Posts? Because there's lots of them.
Yeah. So this is
Newman Street.
Newman
and East
Street.
Castle
Blue
Street,
Posts,
it's on the corner.
Newman. So
And
your
I'm gonna say,
nearest tube stations are Tottenham Court
Road or
or
Oxford.
Oxford Circus.
Yeah.
But please come and join us. We will be there. We will be drinking pints.
And we'll be upstairs, hopefully.
We should
I'm
be
going to chat
upstairs.
with the charming bar staff, and yeah, apparently the upstairs will be open.
So,
Yes.
to be clear, this is the Blue Posts, 81 Newman Street, Fitzrovia, London, W1T 3ET.
Excellent.
And if you've been affected by any of them, then you can write to that address.
Yeah, send them complaints about the show as well, about our views on Talons.
Yeah, you'll recognise the pub. It's attacked by a dinosaur in the silent version of The Lost World.
Really?
Yep. Well, obviously it's a model of the pub, but sorry to pull away the curtain.
No, it's,
Well, on that bombshell.
Are there pictures of us on Twitter that you can recognise us by? Or John did threaten to wear a fez the other day.
John will wear the fez.
I'm going to wear the fez.
We will festoon. I'll try and bring along a Dalek or something so we can festoon the table with something Doctor Who-ish. Yeah. And I don't know if there'll be.
If there's more than one fez wearer when you enter the pub,
if there's more than one
just embarrassedly turn on your heels and go somewhere else.
Or if another Doctor Who podcast is having rival drinks at the same time, we can get into
the barman did
enjoyable
say there's a
Go
Tommy
join
Cooper
them.
convention at the same time.
Anyway, we're skirting around the point. Come and
Yes.
join us. 28th of January, Saturday, 3 p.m. Blue Post on Newman Street. Please see you there. It'll be great to see.
3 till 3:30.
Yes.
It's going to be fantastic.
We'll
Shorter
be back
than one of the
next
podcasts.
month anyway with some more top quality content. Just like
Yeah. So apologies for my cold if I've been sort of coughing and snorting all the way through.
You're in your
this,
prime, Jim.
Although I have a feeling that this cold might last for
You
at
think
least
it
another
might last?
month.
That would be awful.
It'd be awful.
So you
if
think
this
in
lasted
February I
well
might be in
into
the same
February.
condition? How
Yeah, it'd be
awful.
terrible. So join us on the 28th for drinks. If you can't, do still drop us an email. Say hello at I'llExplainLater.com. Find us on Facebook, facebook.com/I'llExplainLater. Twitter, we are on Twitter @ExplainLaterPod. And star ratings and reviews on iTunes are always very welcome.
Please.
And point people towards the show. Tell us we are here. Tell us how much you like it. So that's it for this month.
Just Happy New Year to everyone. Thanks for downloading.
We'll see you next month.
Bye-bye.
Ta-ra. But my point is that it's got a certain set of specificity. It's got some particular things going.
And made near Birmingham, James Hall. Jam Hall?
Jane Hall.
James Hall. I got James and Jim mixed up. I
Your
might
own
take
name.
that bit again.
Yeah.